My name is Claire, and I'm 26 years old. For the past 3 years, my mom has sent me $1,800 every single month. No conditions, no questions. Just a quiet deposit into my account like clockwork. Most people hear that and instantly decide they know everything about me. They picture someone spoiled, living in luxury, floating through life without a care. They imagine I've never worried about a bill or hesitated before swiping my card. And, to be fair, for a long time, they wouldn't have been entirely wrong. But what none of them knew, what I didn't even realize myself, was that the same money that kept my life comfortable was also keeping me stuck. And the day my mom decided I didn't deserve it anymore, my entire world shifted. Before I explain how it all fell apart, make sure you like this video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe. Because this story isn't just about losing money, it's about losing the life I thought I wanted. When the deposit hit my account on the first of each month, I barely glanced at it anymore. It wasn't a surprise, it was routine. Rent for my small apartment, groceries, utilities. That's what the money was supposed to cover. But in my world, essentials had a different meaning. My essentials included 6 oat milk lattes every morning from the cafe downstairs, skincare products I bought because an influencer mentioned them once, and boutique candles that burned out in days. I'd justify every purchase as self-care. My friends teased me. My cousins called me lucky. Even coworkers at a short-lived retail job made jokes about how I didn't really need to work. I laughed with them, pretending it didn't matter, but inside I wore the allowance like a badge. It wasn't just money. It was proof that my mom believed in me, trusted me, wanted me to have more than she did at my age. At least, that's what I told myself. Looking back, I never really questioned why she did it. She had always been financially secure. Good job, mortgage paid off, vacations abroad. In my mind, $1,800 a month was nothing to her. And because she never hinted at struggling, I never stopped to think about whether it was sustainable or whether it was actually helping me. She had started giving me an allowance in high school, just $50 a week back then. In college, it became $500 a month. After graduation, she called the $1,800 a temporary boost to help you get started. Only, somehow, that temporary arrangement lasted over 3 years. Because the safety net was there, I floated from job to job. Short-term contracts, freelance projects, part-time stints. If something didn't work out, I'd quit without panic. The urgency to build a career never fully landed on me. I told myself I was being selective with opportunities, but in reality, I wasn't pushing forward because I didn't have to. There was always next month's deposit. Always a cushion. There were moments, fleeting ones, when I felt a twinge of guilt. Watching friends split bills with surgical precision at restaurants. Hearing coworkers talk about scraping together rent. I'd feel a quiet discomfort, but it faded as quickly as it came. I thought, it's not my fault my situation is better. And maybe it wasn't. But what I didn't see then was how much it was costing me in other ways. The first sign of a shift came at a family barbecue. I was loading my plate when my aunt leaned over and said, "You know, your mom's been very good to you. I hope you appreciate it." I smiled, said, "Of course," and kept walking. I didn't dwell on it. In my head, appreciation meant saying thank you when the money arrived. I thought that was enough. That summer, I booked a week in Miami with friends. Flights, hotel, food, and nights out, all funded by that month's allowance. I didn't think twice. But when I came home, there was a short note from my mom in the mail. She wasn't angry. Her words were measured. She was proud I was living on my own, but wanted to remind me that the allowance was meant for stability, not constant travel. She said she hoped I was being mindful. I read it twice, shrugged, and shoved it in a drawer. To me, it sounded like overprotective caution, not a warning. What I didn't realize was that this was the first crack in the arrangement. That note wasn't just about a vacation, it was about her seeing a pattern. One where I wasn't building independence, just building comfort. One where I'd learned to expect rather than appreciate. And the day she'd decide I no longer deserved the $1,800 wasn't far away. At the time, though, I felt untouchable. I had the allowance everyone envied. and I believed it would last forever. When you live with a steady flow of money you didn't earn, something strange happens. Your baseline shifts. What once felt like abundance starts to feel normal. And when normal becomes the standard, even small inconveniences feel like injustice. That's where I was, living on $1,800 a month from my mom, plus whatever I picked up in sporadic freelance work, and still finding reasons to complain. It started with little comments. If the deposit hit my account a day late because of a bank holiday, I'd text her, "Did you send it yet?" If the rent went up slightly and the numbers felt tight, I'd sigh and say, "I might need more next month." I didn't see those comments as ungrateful. I saw them as practical. But the truth was, I wasn't adjusting to reality. I was adjusting reality to fit what I wanted. That spring, my grocery bill went up. I didn't change my shopping habits. I still bought pre-cut fruit, imported cheese, and the fancy oat milk that cost double the store brand. But instead of scaling back, I sent my mom a message saying the allowance wasn't stretching as far as it used to. She replied with a simple, "You'll have to budget a bit tighter." It stung, more than it should have. It wasn't a refusal to help. It was a refusal to adjust to my lifestyle. And I didn't like that. Around the same time, my friends and I planned a short trip to Los Angeles. Flights, Airbnb, car rental, it added up fast. I justified it in my head. I hadn't traveled since Miami the summer before, and I deserved the break. When I told my mom about it, she didn't forbid me from going, but I could hear the pause in her voice. "You've been traveling a lot lately," she said. "Just be careful you're not spending beyond your means." I brushed it off with a laugh, but the phrase stuck with me. Beyond your means. In my mind, my means were whatever the allowance could cover, plus the occasional freelance payment. I never thought about what would happen if that allowance stopped. One afternoon, I was out shopping for a birthday gift for a friend when I found a handbag I loved. It was on sale, down from $320 to $240. I didn't hesitate. I bought it. That night, my mom called. Not about the bag specifically, but about the way my bank account looked. She had access because, in her words, "It's just easier if we're transparent." She mentioned the purchase in passing, asking if I'd budgeted for the rest of the month. I told her I'd be fine, but I could feel her concern through the phone, and instead of hearing it as care, I heard it as criticism. The more she pushed for me to think ahead, the more defensive I became. I'd point out that I wasn't in debt, that my bills were paid, that I wasn't living recklessly. But if I'd been honest with myself, I'd have admitted that I was skating on the surface of financial responsibility without ever diving deeper. It's easy to look stable when someone else is quietly holding the safety net beneath you. I remember one conversation in particular that left me rattled. I'd mentioned feeling broke toward the end of the month, and my mom asked what I'd been spending on. I gave her vague answers, groceries, bills, just stuff, but she pressed for details. I got irritated. I told her it wasn't fair to scrutinize me when she'd always said the allowance was mine to manage. Her voice was calm when she replied, "It's not scrutiny, Claire. It's concern. You can't live like this forever." I laughed it off, but something in my chest tightened. Instead of adjusting, I doubled down on my spending habits, as if to prove I could handle it. If I wanted takeout twice in one day, I ordered it. If I wanted the upgraded seat on a flight, I bought it. But beneath the surface, there was a growing tension between us. She was starting to see the cracks in my version of independence, and I was starting to feel the weight of her unspoken expectations. The turning point came at the end of a month, when I'd miscalculated my expenses. A bigger-than-expected utility bill and a last-minute dinner out had left me with less than $50 in my account a week before the next deposit. I called my mom, half expecting her to just send an extra $200 without a second thought. Instead, she paused and said, "I think it's time we talk about how you're managing this money." It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't even a scolding. But it was the first time I realized she was seriously considering that maybe I wasn't using the allowance the way she'd intended. I told myself she was overreacting. I told myself she didn't understand how expensive things were now, how hard it was to keep up with everything. But deep down, I knew she was right. I just wasn't ready to admit it. And I had no idea that this was only the beginning. That soon, she'd make a decision I couldn't charm, joke, or talk my way out of. It started quietly. No big confrontation, no slammed doors, no dramatic ultimatum, just a single conversation that left me unsettled for days afterward. It was the middle of a Wednesday when my mom called. I assumed it was her usual check-in, but after the small talk, she said, "Claire, I want to go over your monthly expenses with you." Her tone was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that told me she had already made up her mind about something. I tried to deflect, laughing and saying, "You know me, I just pay what needs paying and live my life." But she didn't laugh. She asked for specifics: rent, utilities, groceries, transportation. And then she asked about the extras. By extras, she meant my coffees, my takeout, my shopping. All the things I'd convinced myself were harmless. When I hesitated to answer, she said something that stuck to me like glue. "Claire, you've gotten too comfortable living like this. If I stopped sending the money tomorrow, what would you do?" The question landed like a punch to the chest. I made a joke about starting a GoFundMe for my lifestyle, but my laugh sounded hollow, even to me. She didn't laugh at all. After that call, I felt restless. The allowance had always been the one constant in my life. Jobs came and went, friendships shifted, apartments changed, but that $1,800 was reliable, predictable. Now, for the first time, I realized it was only reliable because she allowed it to be. And that allowance was suddenly feeling a lot more fragile. A week later, I got the first real sign that things were different. The deposit came in, not late, not reduced, but with a note attached in the bank transfer description. Instead of the usual monthly allowance, it read, "Temporary support, review soon." I stared at the words until they blurred. Review soon. What did that even mean? I didn't call her. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing I'd noticed, but inside, I was spiraling. The following weekend, I stopped by her house for dinner. It was the first time in months I'd gone there without asking for anything. I thought maybe showing up, making conversation, and acting like the good daughter would smooth over whatever was making her second-guess our arrangement. But halfway through the meal, she brought it up. "I've been thinking a lot about your future, Claire. About whether I'm really helping you by giving you money every month." Her voice wasn't angry. It was almost sad. And that made it worse. I tried to explain that I was building my freelance work, that the allowance gave me the stability to take risks. She didn't argue, but she didn't nod either. She just said, "I'm not sure if stability is what you're getting, or if it's keeping you from standing on your own." That night, I left her house with a knot in my stomach. I wanted to believe she was bluffing, that this was just her way of pushing me to be more careful without actually changing anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a bluff. Over the next month, I noticed little shifts in her behavior. If I mentioned buying something, she'd ask, "Did you budget for that?" If I talked about going out with friends, she'd say, "Sounds fun, but maybe you could put that money toward savings instead." They were small comments, but they added up. And they all pointed in one direction. She was testing me, watching to see if I could be responsible without her having to enforce it. The truth was, I couldn't. Not then. By the end of that month, my account balance was down to $23, with 3 days to go before the next deposit. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd been there before, and the money always came. But then, on the morning of the 1st, I opened my banking app and froze. The deposit was there, but it wasn't $1,800. It was $1,200. I called her immediately, heart pounding. She answered on the second ring. "I reduced it," she said simply, before I even asked. "I want to see how you do with less." I was speechless. My mind raced with calculations. What could I cut? What could I delay? What would have to go entirely? She didn't yell. She didn't scold. She just said, "Claire, this is the first step. We'll talk again next month." And that was it. It should have been the wake-up call I needed. But instead of facing it head-on, I went into panic mode. I called friends to vent, painting myself as the victim. I told them my mom was being controlling, unreasonable, that she didn't understand how expensive life was. Some sympathized, others stayed quiet. and I didn't realize it yet. But those silences were the first cracks in more than just my allowance. They were cracks in the image I'd built of myself as independent, capable, deserving. Because maybe my mom wasn't wrong. Maybe I really had gotten too comfortable. And maybe this was just the beginning of what she had planned. The first month with the reduced allowance felt like walking a tightrope. I told myself I'd adapt, that $1,200 wasn't that different from $1,800 if I just adjusted a little. But my definition of adjust wasn't about changing habits. It was about finding temporary workarounds that let me keep living exactly the way I always had. In other words, I didn't cut back. I improvised. Badly. The first week was fine. Rent came out, the utility bill was paid, and I stocked my fridge with the same groceries as before. No substitutions, no cheaper brands. By week 2, I noticed the balance shrinking faster than usual. But instead of confronting the problem, I leaned on my credit card just this once for a dinner out. That once became twice. Then 3 times. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd pay it off when the next month's deposit came. It wasn't until I opened my banking app one Friday morning and saw just $67 left that I realized I'd made no progress at all. The same pattern, early confidence, mid-month denial, end-of-month scramble, was playing out exactly like before. Only now, the safety net was thinner. I still hadn't told my mom I was struggling. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of saying, "I told you so." But the truth was, I was floundering. One Saturday afternoon, I walked into a boutique downtown, just to look. It was the kind of place I usually avoided because everything was overpriced. But that day, I saw a dress on display. Sleek, minimal, perfect for an upcoming friend's birthday dinner. It was $180, half my remaining budget for the month. I bought it anyway. At the register, I felt a flash of guilt. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because I knew I shouldn't be buying it. That feeling faded the moment I slipped it on at home and admired my reflection. I posted a mirror selfie, tagged the store, and soaked in the compliments from friends. For a brief moment, it felt worth it. 2 days later, my internet bill hit. Then the phone bill. Then the gym membership. And just like that, I was down to $12 with 10 days to go. I panicked. I called a friend and suggested we hang out at my place instead of going out, framing it as wanting a cozy night in. The truth was, I couldn't afford to split a restaurant bill without dipping further into my credit card. It was around that time that my mom called to check in. I tried to keep my voice light, but she picked up on something. "How's it going with the new budget?" she asked. I lied. I said it was fine, that I was learning to be more intentional. She didn't push, but I could tell she didn't entirely believe me. The breaking point came the following week. I was scrolling through Instagram and saw an ad for a weekend workshop on personal branding. It looked interesting. It also cost $250. I didn't have $250, not in my checking account anyway, so I charged it to my credit card without a second thought. I convinced myself it was an investment, something that could help me grow my freelance work, maybe even lead to more income. But deep down, I knew it was just another way to avoid facing the reality of my finances. By the time the first of the month rolled around again, my checking account was at 0, my credit card balance was higher than it had been in years, and I was already waiting for the deposit like a lifeline. When it hit, the relief was instant. But so was the shame. Because here's the thing, I knew I could have made it work on $1,200. Other people did it with far less. But instead of adjusting, I'd treated it like a challenge to see how far I could stretch my old habits without breaking them. Spoiler, they broke. That month, my mom didn't say anything about the amount. It was still $1,200, no note attached. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching, that she knew exactly what I was doing, even if she didn't confront me. And maybe she was waiting for me to admit it myself. I didn't. If I'm honest, I think a part of me still believed she'd eventually bump it back up to $1,800. That this was just a phase, a temporary experiment she'd get tired of. But I didn't know then that her next move wouldn't just lower the safety net. It would take it away completely. And when it did, I wouldn't be ready. The message came on the last day of the month. It was a short text from my mom, the kind she usually sent when reminding me about a family birthday or a dentist appointment. "We need to talk about the allowance. Call me tonight." I stared at it for a few seconds, telling myself it couldn't be anything serious. She'd already reduced it to $1,200. Maybe she wanted to see how it was going. Maybe she'd decided to bring it back up. That was the thought I clung to all day, letting it settle like a warm blanket over my nerves. When I finally called that evening, she answered on the first ring. There was no small talk, no easing into it. "Claire," she said, "starting next month, I'm cutting the allowance entirely." The words landed like ice water. "What?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Why? You can't just—" "I can," she interrupted. "And I have to. This was meant to help you get started, not to fund your lifestyle indefinitely." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For 3 years, that money had been as reliable as the sunrise. The idea of it disappearing felt impossible, like she'd announced gravity was optional now. "I don't understand," I said. "I'm not irresponsible. I pay my bills. You scrape by every month and put the rest on your credit card," she cut in. "That's not stability, Claire. That's dependence. And it's time for that to change." I wanted to argue, to remind her that she'd never said there was a time limit, that she'd encouraged me to live on my own. But the truth stuck like a lump in my throat. She was right. I had been leaning on that money like it was a given. I'd built my life around it without ever thinking about what would happen if it went away. And now it was going away. "This isn't fair," I said finally, my voice shaking more from fear than anger. "You're pulling the rug out from under me." "No," she said gently. "I'm taking away the rug you've been sitting on instead of learning to stand. You're 26, Claire. You're smart. You can work. You should work. But you won't. Not as long as I keep making it this easy for you." The words stung because they were true. After the call, I sat on my couch staring at the blank TV screen. The numbers in my head were immediate and brutal. Rent was due in 5 days, and without the deposit, I had less than half of it in my account. The rest of the bills? Not even close. It hit me then how little I'd saved. All those months, I could have set aside even $100. But I never did. The idea of saving had always felt unnecessary. Now it wasn't just necessary. It was urgent. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying her words. It's time for that to change. I cycled through emotions: shock, anger, fear, guilt. Part of me still wanted to believe she was bluffing, that she'd see me struggle for a month and give in. But another part, the part that knew my mom, understood she wouldn't reverse this decision. When she made up her mind, she meant it. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started applying for jobs. Not freelance gigs, not short-term contracts. Actual jobs with actual paychecks. But my resume looked thin. Too many gaps. Too many roles that sounded more like hobbies than careers. For the first time, I saw how my choices over the last few years had shaped not just my finances, but my future. I'd been coasting, and the paper trail proved it. That week was a blur of online applications, awkward interviews, and the sinking realization that the lifestyle I'd built couldn't survive without the allowance. I sold a few pieces of furniture I didn't need. I canceled subscriptions I barely used. I skipped dinners out, avoided the boutique cafes, and learned how to make coffee at home. Each change felt small, almost symbolic, but together, they marked the beginning of something I hadn't felt in years. Urgency. By the end of the month, I'd landed a part-time receptionist job at a co-working space. It paid $17 an hour, barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but it was a start. Walking into that office on my first day, I felt a mix of pride and humiliation. Pride that I'd found something quickly, humiliation that I needed this kind of push to get here in the first place. In quiet moments, I still caught myself feeling resentful toward my mom. But beneath that resentment was something else I didn't want to name yet: gratitude. Because she could have kept paying me. She could have let me drift for another year, maybe 2, until the real world hit even harder. Instead, she'd forced me to face it now, while I still had time to rebuild. I didn't know then that losing the allowance wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The first month without the allowance felt like being dropped into cold water. There was no easing in, no gradual adjustment. One day I was living with the comfort of knowing $1,800 would hit my account no matter what I did. The next, I was staring at my banking app, watching the numbers fall with every bill and grocery run, knowing nothing was coming to refill it. The receptionist job paid bi-weekly, but the first check didn't arrive until 3 weeks after I started. That meant I had to stretch the little I had left in my account across rent, utilities, food, and whatever unexpected expenses decided to appear. I'd never thought of myself as wasteful before. But when you're forced to track every single dollar, you start seeing all the places it used to disappear without you noticing. The coffee shop downstairs from my apartment became my first casualty. I'd once considered it part of my routine, almost a daily ritual. Now, each $6 latte looked less like self-care and more like sabotage. Instead, I bought a $12 bag of ground coffee from the supermarket and taught myself how to make something halfway decent at home. It wasn't the same, but watching the savings pile up, even in small amounts, gave me a strange satisfaction I wasn't used to feeling. Grocery shopping transformed from an afterthought into a strategy session. I swapped brand names for generics, fresh berries for frozen, pre-cut vegetables for whole ones I'd have to chop myself. I compared prices, weighed portions, planned meals for the week instead of buying whatever looked good in the moment. The first time I walked out of the store with a week's worth of food for under $50, I felt almost victorious. Rent was the hardest part. It swallowed more than half of my monthly income, leaving me little room to maneuver. I thought about moving somewhere cheaper, but breaking my lease would come with penalties I couldn't afford. So I stayed put and made cuts elsewhere. Streaming subscriptions were canceled. Gym membership, gone. Nights out with friends were replaced with walks in the park or evenings at my apartment with a bottle of $8 wine. I started to notice how much of my old life had been padded with unnecessary expenses disguised as necessities. The hardest adjustment wasn't financial, it was mental. I'd built my identity around being someone who could say yes. Yes to dinner out. Yes to a weekend trip. Yes to buying the dress without checking the price tag. Now, every yes had to be earned. And sometimes, it had to be replaced with a number. There were moments when the reality of it all hit harder than I expected. Like the night I came home exhausted from work, opened my fridge, and realized I didn't have anything quick to eat. My old self would have just ordered delivery. My new self stood there, staring at the shelves, calculating whether I could justify spending $20 on takeout. I made pasta instead. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. At work, I kept my financial struggles to myself. My coworkers saw me as the new hire learning the ropes, not as the woman quietly trying to rewire her entire relationship with money. There were moments of temptation, like when they'd all chip in for a catered lunch or suggest happy hour after work. I'd smile, make an excuse, and head home. I told myself it was temporary, that once I got my footing, I could loosen the reins a little. Every so often, my mom would call. She didn't bring up the allowance. She didn't ask if I was managing. I think she knew that if I was really in trouble, I'd reach out. And even though part of me wanted to, just to make it easier, I didn't. I couldn't. Because asking for help now would feel like undoing everything I was trying to build. As the weeks passed, I started to notice changes in myself. Not just in my bank account, but in my mindset. I was thinking ahead in a way I never had before, planning for bills before they arrived, setting aside a small cushion from each paycheck, even if it was just $20, cooking meals that lasted for days. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't Instagram-worthy. But it was sustainable. There were still slip-ups. Like the time I convinced myself I deserved a new pair of shoes after a long week. Or when I splurged on takeout for no reason other than craving it. But each time, I caught myself faster. And each time, it was easier to pull back. The turning point came one quiet Sunday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd made myself, going over my budget. It was the first time in months I felt like I was in control, not just reacting to whatever happened. For years, I'd lived in a bubble where money appeared without effort. Now, every dollar I had was one I'd earned, and that made it mean something. I realized then that my mom hadn't just been cutting me off, she'd been setting me free. I wasn't ready to tell her that yet, but I knew it. I didn't know it at the time, but this was the beginning of something bigger than just adjusting to life without her money. This was the start of me finally building my own. The receptionist job was never supposed to be permanent. When I accepted it, I told myself it was a placeholder, a quick fix until something better came along. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't align with my career goals, and the pay barely covered the essentials. But it was money I'd earned on my own, and that meant something. The co-working space was busy but not overwhelming. A constant flow of freelancers, entrepreneurs, and remote workers passed through the glass doors every day. My tasks were simple: greet people, manage bookings, answer phones, keep the front desk running smoothly. It wasn't hard. It was routine. And routine was something I hadn't had in a long time. The first shock came in the form of the schedule. 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. No leisurely mornings scrolling through my phone while sipping overpriced coffee. No midweek beach trips because I needed a break. I was expected to show up on time, every time. And when you've spent years living on your own clock, the adjustment is brutal. The first week, I was exhausted by Wednesday. My feet ached from standing, my voice was sore from answering phones, and my brain felt foggy by the end of each day. But something interesting started to happen. I found myself sleeping better. My days had structure. I didn't waste hours wondering what to do next because the schedule was already decided for me. Paydays became small milestones. That first check wasn't huge, but holding it in my hands felt different than any allowance deposit ever had. This wasn't money given because someone loved me or felt obligated. This was money tied directly to my effort, my hours, my presence. I started keeping a little notebook to track what I earned, what I spent, and what I could set aside. The numbers were small, but they were mine. Still, the adjustment wasn't smooth. There were moments when I resented the job. When I watched people breeze past my desk to work on projects that seemed exciting and fulfilling, I felt a pang of jealousy. They were building businesses, launching products, closing deals. While I was reminding people where the bathrooms were, the old me would have quit at the first sign of boredom. But quitting wasn't an option anymore. Rent didn't care if I was uninspired. Groceries didn't wait for me to find myself, so I stayed. And I learned. Over time, I started noticing the people around me. The woman who ran a small design firm and always brought her own lunch. The guy who worked late into the night on a startup, often wearing the same shirt 2 days in a row. The quiet programmer who never said much but seemed to be making real progress on something big. They all worked hard, every day. It was humbling to realize that the kind of life I used to imagine for myself, the independence, the flexibility, the security, wasn't built on free time and luck. It was built on consistency. There were also little moments that reminded me how far I'd come. Like the afternoon a delivery driver showed up with 2 massive coffee carriers for a meeting, and the client tipped me $10 just for helping carry them upstairs. It was small, almost laughable compared to my old allowance, but it felt unexpectedly good. Or the day a woman complimented the dress I was wearing, one I'd bought secondhand after learning to shop with intention. Instead of shrugging it off, I told her exactly where I'd found it, proud of the deal I'd scored. 3 months in, my manager asked if I wanted to take on some extra responsibilities: event coordination, managing incoming inquiries, handling small billing issues. It came with a slight pay bump, nothing huge, but I said yes without hesitation. The old me might have turned it down, thinking it wasn't worth the extra effort, but now I saw it as another step toward something bigger. My mom never asked directly about the job, but I'd sometimes catch her listening a little closer when I mentioned it. I think she was waiting to see if I'd stick with it. I didn't tell her everything. The long days, the moments of doubt, the temptation to slip back into old habits. But I did tell her I was saving a little from each paycheck. That was true. It wasn't much, but it was steady. The real shift happened quietly, almost without me noticing. At some point, I stopped thinking of the job as temporary and started thinking of it as, for now. It might not have been my dream, but it was a foundation. And foundations are what you build on. I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to hand me stability. I was making it myself. There were still days when I missed the ease of my old life. The freedom, the security, the indulgences I didn't think twice about. But I also remembered the constant undercurrent of dependency. The quiet fear of what would happen if my mom ever pulled the plug. That fear was gone now, and in its place was something I hadn't expected to find at the front desk of a co-working space: pride. I didn't know it yet, but the lessons I was learning here, about discipline, about budgeting, about showing up even when I didn't feel like it, were going to shape everything that came next. This wasn't just a job I never wanted. It was the start of a life I didn't know I needed. The thing about changing your life is that the world doesn't always notice. You can work harder, live differently, and rebuild yourself from the inside out, but to some people, you'll always be who you were. And sometimes, they'll remind you in ways that feel like paper cuts. Small, but sharp enough to sting. It started with an afternoon coffee break at work. I was in the break room pouring the last of the office drip coffee when two of my coworkers came in mid-conversation. They didn't notice me at first. "Claire's lucky," one of them said. "She doesn't really need this job." The other laughed. "Yeah, she's that girl who gets money from her mom, right?" I froze, holding the paper cup, pretending to focus on adding sugar so they wouldn't see my reaction. "That was before," the first one added, in a tone that didn't sound convinced. "I think she still does, though." By the time they realized I was there, I had already pasted on a polite smile and slipped out of the room. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that, but it was the first time it hit differently. Back when it was true, I might have brushed it off, even worn it as a weird badge of honor. But now, after months of earning every cent I spent, it felt unfair. Like my effort was invisible. On the walk home that night, the conversation replayed in my head. I wanted to tell them they were wrong, to explain everything: the reduction, the cut, the job hunt, the budgeting. But a part of me knew that the people who really mattered already knew. And maybe I didn't need to prove anything to anyone else. Still, it lingered. And it made me start noticing other moments I might have let slide before, like the dinner with a group of old friends from college. Halfway through, someone joked about Claire's famous bank of mom when the bill came. Everyone laughed. It was meant to be lighthearted, but my stomach tightened. I didn't correct them. Not because it wasn't worth it, but because I didn't feel like opening the door to questions and skepticism. The idea of defending myself made me tired. Even with my family, there were echoes of the old narrative. One Sunday, I visited my cousin Sarah, who was going through a rough patch financially. We were sitting on her porch when she said, "Must be nice, knowing your mom's always got your back if things get tough." It was meant as a compliment, maybe even reassurance. But to me, it felt like a reminder that no matter how much I worked now, my past would always shadow me. I told her quietly, "She doesn't support me anymore. It's just me now." Sarah looked surprised, but not in the way I hoped. "Really? Wow. Didn't think that day would ever come." Her tone wasn't judgmental, just honest. And that honesty hit harder than I expected. These conversations weren't cruel. They weren't meant to tear me down. But they revealed how people had seen me all those years, and how much of that image still clung to me. I began to realize that rebuilding my life wasn't just about money. It was about reputation. About shifting the way people understood me, one interaction at a time. One night, lying in bed, I thought about how I had contributed to that old image. The Instagram stories of me on vacation, the casual mentions of expensive dinners, the way I used to joke about not really needing to work. I had fed the narrative. I had leaned into it because it was easier than explaining the truth, that I wasn't rich, I was just subsidized. And now, even though my reality had changed, those old signals still lingered in people's minds. It made me more deliberate in the way I presented myself. Not in a performative way, but in being honest when it came up. When a coworker mentioned wanting to buy something pricey, instead of nodding along like I used to, I'd talk about how I budgeted for purchases now. When friends joked about my allowance, I'd simply say, "That ended months ago. I've been on my own since." Some people seemed surprised, others didn't react at all. But for me, it was less about their reaction and more about reclaiming the narrative. The turning point came unexpectedly, during a conversation with my manager. She stopped by my desk one Friday afternoon to thank me for handling a last-minute event booking. As she was leaving, she paused and said, "You know, Claire, you've really proven yourself here. When you first started, I honestly wasn't sure how long you'd last." I raised an eyebrow, half amused, half curious. "Why's that?" She smiled in a way that was both kind and knowing. "Because sometimes people take jobs like this as a stopgap, but you've shown up, every day, and that matters." It was the closest thing to external validation I'd had in months, and it meant more than I expected. Walking home that evening, I thought about how far I'd come, not in the sense of money earned, but in the sense of who I was becoming. The conversations that stung still happened, but they didn't undo me anymore. Because for every comment that echoed the old me, there was a moment that confirmed the new me was real, even if not everyone could see it yet. I didn't know it, but the more I embraced my independence, the more I was setting the stage for the next step, one that would take me beyond just surviving without the allowance, and into building something that was truly mine. But first, I had to finish letting go of the person I used to be. It didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. There was no lightning bolt of inspiration, no tearful breakdown, no sudden windfall that changed everything overnight. My breakthrough came quietly, like the tide creeping up the shore. So gradual you don't notice it until your feet are already in the water. It began one Tuesday morning at the co-working space. I'd been asked to cover an early client meeting, which meant unlocking the building before sunrise. The streets were empty, still damp from overnight rain, and the city felt different in those hours. Less chaotic, more honest. As I stood at the front desk, coffee in hand, I watched the first clients filter in. A pair of young founders in hoodies, a graphic designer balancing a tablet under one arm, a copywriter with a laptop covered in stickers. They weren't here for the perks. They weren't here to look busy. They were here because they believed in something they were building. And for the first time in years, I realized I missed that feeling. There was a time when I'd dreamed of running something of my own. Back in college, I'd toyed with ideas, small businesses, creative projects, but I'd never pushed past the early stages. Part of it was fear, but part of it, I now knew, was comfort. When you have money coming in without risk, the urgency to take a leap fades. Now, with no safety net and no illusions, urgency was all I had. That afternoon, during my lunch break, I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed out the words, "What can I build?" It wasn't a plan yet, just a question. But I wrote down every idea that came to mind, no matter how ridiculous. A curated gift box service, a personal budget coaching program, a secondhand clothing shop. When I looked at the list later, one thing stood out. Almost all of them involved skills I already had: organization, design, communication. None of them required huge upfront investments, just time, focus, and consistency. Consistency. The very thing I'd been practicing for months without realizing it. Over the next few weeks, I used my evenings to research. I stayed late at the co-working space after my shift ended, using the quiet hours to read about small business setups, low-cost marketing, and how to find your first clients. The more I learned, the more possible it all seemed. But there was still the voice in my head, the one that remembered the old me, the one that doubted I could really do this without falling back into old patterns. So I set a rule for myself. Whatever I chose to build, I wouldn't tell anyone outside of a small circle until I had something tangible to show. No half announcements, no public working on a project posts. I wanted proof, not promises. The turning point came when a woman I'd met at the front desk, an event planner, mentioned she needed someone to design simple, branded welcome kits for her corporate retreats. She said it offhandedly, like she was just venting, but I heard opportunity in her voice. "I can do that," I said before I could talk myself out of it. By the end of the week, she'd sent me the details, and I'd spent 2 late nights putting together mock-ups using free design software. She loved them. She placed a small order, nothing huge, but enough to cover my groceries for the month. And more importantly, it gave me something I hadn't felt in years: momentum. From there, I leaned in. I reached out to a handful of other professionals I'd met through the co-working space, offering similar services at starter rates. Some ignored me. Others said they'd keep me in mind. A few said yes. Each yes was fuel. I'd work my shifts at the front desk during the day, then spend my evenings and weekends fulfilling orders, improving designs, learning how to streamline the process. It was exhausting, but it was mine. By the end of 3 months, I'd earned more from this side work than I'd made in my first month at the receptionist job. It wasn't enough to quit, but it was enough to prove that I could create income without relying on anyone, not my mom, not a traditional employer, not a fluke of luck. That realization was my breakthrough. Because the truth was, it had never been just about the money. It was about control, about knowing that I could make choices without fearing the floor would fall out from under me. One evening, I sat in my apartment with my notebook, the same one I'd started when I first began budgeting. I flipped back to the early pages, where my notes were shaky and scattered, filled with lists of expenses and small panics about what I could cut. Now the pages were different. They held goals, revenue targets, client ideas, plans for how to grow this little service into something that could eventually stand on its own. I realized I hadn't thought about the allowance in weeks. Around this time, my mom invited me to lunch. We met at a quiet cafe, and for the first time since she'd cut me off, the conversation didn't revolve around money. She asked how work was going. I told her about the front desk, about learning to manage my time, about building something on the side. She listened, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "You seem different," she said finally. "I am," I told her, and I meant it. Walking home that day, I thought about how far I'd come since the moment she said the allowance was over. Back then, it felt like the end of the world. Now, I could see it for what it was: the push I needed to start living for real. It had forced me to stop waiting for life to happen and start building it myself. The breakthrough wasn't flashy. There was no big announcement, no applause. It was simply the moment I realized I didn't want to go back to the way things were. Even if my mom called tomorrow and offered to start the $1,800 deposits again, I'd say no, not because I didn't need the money, but because I didn't need the dependency. That night, I opened my laptop and added a new line to the top of my goals list. Within 12 months, replace receptionist income with my own business revenue. It wasn't just a goal, it was a promise to myself. For the first time, I knew I could keep it. It's strange how life can change so much without a single defining moment. When I look back now, there's no one day that marks the exact point where I made it. There was no viral success, no unexpected investor, no sudden lottery win. My transformation happened the same way the seasons shift, slowly, subtly, until one morning you wake up and realize it's no longer winter. 6 months after I set the goal to replace my receptionist income with my own business revenue, I hit it. Not all at once, but in steady, incremental steps. A new client here, a larger order there, a referral that snowballed into a monthly retainer. I learned how to say no to work that didn't fit my long-term vision and how to say yes to opportunities that scared me but promised growth. The co-working space was still my anchor. I stayed there even after I technically didn't need the paycheck anymore, partly for the security and partly because it had become a hub for connections. Every conversation at the front desk was a potential lead, every small task an opening to prove my reliability. What surprised me most wasn't just the money, it was how my relationship with it had changed. Back when I lived on my mom's allowance, every dollar felt disposable. If it was in my account, it was meant to be spent. Now, each payment I received carried the weight of the work it took to earn it. That weight didn't feel like a burden, it felt like value. I started saving without thinking about it. I built an emergency fund. I invested in tools and resources that made my business smoother and more professional. And for the first time in years, I could look at my bank balance without that lurking fear of, what if the deposit doesn't come? One Friday evening, as I was closing up the front desk, my manager stopped me. "I have to say, Claire," she began, "I've never seen someone change so much in such a short time. You're not the same person who started here." I smiled, knowing exactly what she meant. I'm not. And I wasn't. That weekend, I took myself out to dinner, alone. Not to celebrate a single achievement, but to acknowledge the sum of them. As I sat at the corner table with a glass of wine, I thought about the girl I'd been 2 years ago. The one who believed $1,800 a month from her mom was just normal. The one who could buy a $200 handbag without blinking but had no idea how to build a life without a safety net. I didn't hate that version of me, but I pitied her, because she had no idea what real independence felt like. By the time the 1-year mark rolled around, my business was earning double what I'd made at the receptionist job. I finally left the front desk, not because I was running away from it, but because I was ready. On my last day, I brought in pastries for the team, and as I locked the glass doors behind me, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't an escape. It was a graduation. My mom came over for dinner the following week. It was the first time she'd seen my new apartment. Slightly bigger, better lit, in a quieter neighborhood. Over pasta and red wine, she asked about my clients, my schedule, my plans for the next year. There was no tension in her questions anymore, no hint of doubt, just curiosity and, I think, pride. When she left, she hugged me a little longer than usual. "You've built something real, Claire," she said, "and you've built yourself along with it." I closed the door and stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still slow months, projects that fell through, clients that disappeared without paying. But the difference was, I could handle it now. I had systems, savings, and the confidence that comes from having rebuilt myself once already. I no longer feared losing everything, because I knew I could make it again. The biggest change wasn't just in my bank account or my career. It was in the way I saw myself. I wasn't the girl who gets money from her mom anymore. I wasn't the person people joked about at dinners. I wasn't a character in someone else's narrative about privilege or dependency. I was Claire, a business owner, a woman who could pay her bills, save for her future, and choose her life on her own terms. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the day my mom told me the allowance was over. At the time, it felt like punishment. Now, I see it for what it was, a gift. Not a financial one, but the kind that forces you to grow in ways you never would if someone kept cushioning your fall. I used to believe she was being cruel that day. Now, I believe she was being wise. And if I could speak to the old me, the girl panicking at her kitchen table, wondering how she'd make rent without the $1,800, I'd tell her this. You're about to learn that you're capable of far more than you think. And one day, you'll be grateful for this moment. Today, I don't just have balance in my finances. I have balance in my life, work that fulfills me, time that I control, and the freedom to say yes or no without fear of what will happen next month. And maybe that's the real success. Not the numbers in my account, but the quiet certainty that I've built this, and I can keep building. If you've ever felt like you couldn't survive without someone else's help, I hope my story proves that you can. It won't be easy. It will be messy and uncomfortable and sometimes humiliating. But it will also be the most freeing thing you'll ever do. Because once you've learned to stand on your own, no one can take that away from you. If you agree, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your own experiences. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.